This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. This is a very special Minisode. I'm Brian Murray, joined by Paul Jasley.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Paul. How you doing?
Doing all right. I'm excited to talk about this comic with you, and I'm very curious why you chose this comic to do a Minisode about.
Yeah, today Paul and I are going to be talking about this book that I might have mentioned once or twice. It's called We Only Find Them When They're Dead. Being sarcastic because, of course, I won't shut up about this book.
Yes, and that's I think that's interesting. I remember picking this up initially based purely on the creative team. It's written by Ewing, art by Simone It's published by Boom. And again, Ewing is a name that at this point I'm pretty much willing to buy anything and give it a shot. But Brian, I'm curious why this particular book, maybe the premise of it is what hooked you, or what keeps you coming back to it and wanting to talk about it on the show?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the premise of the book, which is that in the 2300s, weird space gods are kind of like drifting dead up on the shores of our galaxy. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what they are or where they came from, but that's one heck of a mystery. It certainly has me curious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our main character, George, as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, the premise, as you put it, is pretty much sells the book alone to me. The idea of it's kind of a mix of space pirates, because we have a crew on the spaceship that are chasing down these ancient dead space deities and carving them up for parts, essentially, for resources. That's an interesting concept, but on top of that, I think what keeps the book interesting and keeps me picking it up month to month is the way Ewing uses that almost as a background to tell a much more personal story about the main character and his relationship to the rest of the crew.
Yeah, it's very interesting because this book is at the same time both personal and massive in scope.
Yes. And I like that because ever since Jack and Stan introduced Galactus way back in Fantastic Four number 48, something about comic books and space gods, those two things just go together like peanut butter and chocolate. The idea of, in a comic book, you can draw a giant space deity just floating there in space, and somehow it just makes sense and is just so cool. So when we can marry that to a personal story, it's a really engaging comic,
Yeah, definitely. So I guess what would you say is your favorite part of the comic? Is it that personal story?
I think so. I mean, we're focusing on the story, and I think, again, to me, I think I picked this up based on Al Ewing's name because I enjoyed his work on Zombo and the Immortal Hulk so much that I kind of figured him doing a creator-owned series would be very interesting, and it's paying off so far. And that's really been my main attraction to the book. The way that Ewing, again, almost undersells the vastness and brilliance of the concept of, again, space pirates mining ancient space gods. That becomes the background to a deeper story. You're learning about the main character, George, and his obsession with finding one that's alive, right? And the way that idea of the mystery that's kind of built in, even the title alone, we only find them when they're dead, hinting at a bigger story, and the way Ewing is able to very smallly tease out this bigger relationship between the characters makes it a really engaging read. And I honestly had more of that when I went back to reread it for this episode. Reading it month to month is one of these books that may not work that well, So going back and reading all the issues in a oneer, I saw the bigger picture, the framework of the bigger picture Ewing is putting together more clearly on the reread. And again, it comes down to the small little details he's teasing as the story goes on.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with that. There was, on my first read through, I struggled to follow some of the jumps around in time that happen.
Right. Yeah.
Because George is captain of the Vihan 2, but we occasionally cut back to his parents' vessel, the Vihan 1, which had some kind of accident or was destroyed by the space cops, for lack of a better term.
Right.
And so we kind of got hints to why that might have happened, and his brother is often mentioned. But when I went back and reread it after having sort of absorbed those pieces by themselves, it was much easier to really synthesize them into something more concrete.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way to do the story. Again, I mean, putting space gods and space pirates into a comic is pretty easy, but to give the universe that sort of lived-in feel, to kind of unravel a mystery and make it engaging on top of that, is a really neat trick to pull off. And I think Ewing does it really, really well. He's such a smart storyteller in that he doesn't dump a bunch of information on you. He trusts the reader to put the pieces together for themselves, and kind of follow him wherever he's going to go.
Yeah, and I think that a creator who didn't have the amount of built-in trust that I think Ewing has with a lot of readers might not have been able to pull this off.
Yeah.
I might not have given a different author as much credit as I gave Ewing.
That's true. I mean, there is a weird push and pull there where it's like certain creators, you're willing to give them more leeway when stuff isn't clear right off the bat, because you trust them. So it works both ways, I guess. And I think, again, it's an interesting title because the way each issue sort of begins is this idea of why, George is so interested in finding one alive, right? The idea of like, we only find these space gods when they're dead. Why is that? That's hinting at an even bigger mystery that's kind of beyond the scope of the personal story he's telling. But that's the obsession that's driving the main character, and I think the way Ewing is hinting at something bigger that's clearly going to come down the pike. We're still in the first volume or season, so to speak, of this book, and I think it's just going to get bigger and more massive as it goes on because of that. Yeah,
I mean, this is something that didn't really click with me until you mentioned pirates. They're also a lot like whalers in a sense.
Yeah.
Which makes George kind of a good parallel to Ahab.
Yeah, and the idea of him commanding a crew of people, and you're kind of getting the hint that maybe he has closer relationships with some of the crew than he does others, both physical and emotional. We learn as the book goes on. And the idea that on top of all this, there is, you mentioned the space cops, the sort of governing body that's controlling the spaceways as it is. One thing I find really interesting, and when I went back and reread it, how often the characters have to guard what they're saying, because as they keep hinting at, the ship that they're on has ears, and there can't be a record of some of their conversations. And I really like the sort of built-in secrecy that Ewing has very smartly put in there to make it, more mysterious as it goes on. He can only give you so much information because of this built-in rule he's put in place,
Yeah, it's a really great way to keep things from the reader without just not telling them things for no reason.
Yeah, and again, something about I think it's, again, Ewing as a writer, but the way the book has been able to maintain a mystery and be compelling, again, on top of the already appealing concept of it. So yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed the book. I think maybe, I can't remember if I mentioned it on the show and that inspired you to pick it up, or because...
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think when issue number 1 was coming out, I think you had it as your pick for the following week or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you've claimed it as your own, Brian. It's become your go-to mention on the show, right?
Become my obsession, yeah.
But I also want to talk about the art, because I think maybe this might be a point where we might disagree a little bit. So I'm reading this book month to month in physical issues. Are you reading it digitally or physically?
I am reading it digitally.
Okay. And I wonder if that makes a difference, because I really like Simone de Mio's artwork, but there are times where I find it a bit hard to follow. I think going back to reread it, it clicked for me better, but I remember the first couple issues, me having a hard time teasing out what ship we're on at certain times. Part of that is, again, you mentioned the time jumps. We are jumping between, about a 40-year difference in time, between the past and the present, or 30 years, I guess. But there are times where I found, as much as I like the design of the characters and designs of the ships, and I really like the way the space gods are drawn, I do find it sometimes hard to follow at times. And I wonder if that might just be because the printed page is a little bit more muted as opposed to the brightness of the screen.
No, I do think I see what you're saying. Like, I don't have a good visual idea of like where on the ship each character is.
Sure, yeah.
That also just didn't occur to me to think about.
Okay.
I was much more focused on those character designs, which are great. Like, each character has a very distinctive look, which is very very helpful when you don't know the characters very well yet. You can at least say, oh yeah, that person is the one who does this thing on the ship.
And I think that is sort of aided by the fact that, especially in the first few issues, it does seem like each character is kind of in their own part of the ship, and because of that, they're kind of given a separate color palette. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I remember in that first issue where you're kind of seeing each character is kind of shown in a different color palette, so it's easier to pick out who's who or what part of the ship they're on. And I should mention that the Simone DeMio and then is doing the artwork, and there's color assists by Mariasara Miotti. Sorry. And again, I wonder if the colors might work better on the screen too, because there are times where, as much as I like it, I'm not putting it down. I like the artwork and I like the color a lot, but sometimes I wonder if the printing process mutes the colors in a way that makes it a little bit muddier than it would be on the screen.
I don't think so, because I did actually, like, muted is a word I would use for the colors in this book. But I think it gives it a very dreamlike, ethereal sense to it.
Yeah.
Where it's just very it's tough to put into words beyond just dreamlike.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think we're so used to seeing science fiction being lit and presented a certain way. And this book, as I was going back and rereading it to talk about it today, I kind of realized, again, as you said, you don't really have a sense of how big the ship is or where they are in relationship to each other. And like, I think that kind of helps create the world that they're in, where it's like, you don't know how big this ship is. It's probably bigger than you're imagining. You're used to seeing science fiction where everyone's kind of in the same room on a spaceship, but a ship might not function that way. I mean, just based on the dynamics or mechanics of it. And then you also have, they're in deep space. There's not a lot of light. So basically everyone's being lit by the control panels in whatever part of the ship they're on. So it all makes sense why it looks the way it does, but it's kind of different from the way I usually see science fiction and spaceships presented in most other media. Yeah,
and I think that works. At least it works for me. Yeah, there's a lot of what I would call cool colors. There's lots of blues and purples and greens.
Yeah.
Like you said, there's no what you might call natural light, which,
right.
I mean, it's deep space. That makes sense. And so everything is just sort of lit by, like you said, the control panels, or like the engines of a ship going by, or their giant laser scalpel they use to carve up god flesh.
I just love talking about space gods is just casually like that. It's so fun to me. You mentioned the scalpels, and the one cool thing that I really appreciate is the way that they're able to use the color palette to make things glow. That's one of my favorite gimmicks in comics, whether it's on the screen or on the printed page, the way that whoever designs the colors to make things look like they're actually glowing on the page, even though they're clearly not, it's just ink on a page. But that trick always kind of impresses me when I see it, especially in this book, because it stands out so visually, so vividly.
Yeah, that sort of fuzzy halo of color around things. I love how, in a lot of ways, for most of the people, except George, this has all become very mundane in a way. Like,
yeah.
Harvesting the cheek of this god is just their job. And it's so strange to think about that.
Yeah, there's almost a disconnect between the vastness of what they're doing and the importance of what they're doing, and it just being a job, albeit a very dangerous job at times, but it is just how they make their living. And George still has that sort of twinkle in his eye and this sort of imagination and this lust for it that everyone else seems to have lost. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize that till you mentioned it.
Yeah, like the rest of his crew is kind of on the same page as him, though none of them have his obsession. but all the other people, they're just out there to make a buck. They've lost the wonder of finding a giant being dead on the edge of the galaxy.
Right. I hope I never lose that.
It just goes to show how humans can get used to anything.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really a rich story, and I think it really benefited to go back and reread it. I think the next volume is starting up within the next month or so. We have 5 issues now. Yeah. May, yeah. So we have 5 issues now, and I think Ewing, again, is a very meticulous storyteller, so I feel like there's a lot of things that are going to start paying off in the next volume. But yeah, it's an interesting book to me because as much as I'm enjoying reading it, I really got more out of it on the reread. So it's one of those things like, do I switch to buying it in trade, but I still like supporting the single issues because I really like the cover treatment on these books. So I'm enjoying buying it month to month. So, but it might be one of those books that I do let accumulate and then sit down and read in one go. So
yeah, I think my plan is to buy the physical trades. So I've been buying digital singles, and then when they release the collection, which by the time this episode releases will have come out. But
yes. And hopefully I haven't read it because we have spoiled pretty much a lot of. I mean, we haven't spoiled some stuff, but
yeah,
if you want to go in blind,
we've kept the biggest twist to ourselves so far.
Yes, yeah. And I do want to give a special mention of the cover treatment. Again, it is a very unwieldy title for a comic, I have to admit, and I appreciate the fact that whoever's doing the cover design sort of leaned into that, and basically the cover is the title, right? It takes up the complete cover of the comic, and it just really stands out on the stands. And then, when you're reading the issues, there is the cover or the title page in each issue. It's a double-page spread with that big title spread across both pages. It's a very unique and distinct sort of presentation of it, and I really appreciate it when comics try to look different and stand out that way.
Yeah, it's a very cinematic way of doing it. It reminds me a lot of like the title card for an episode of a TV show, where you might get like the cold open and then you get the musical sting and the title card, and then you're back into the episode.
Yeah. And, Ewing is one of these writers who, when you start to notice certain tricks that he does, you start seeing him everywhere. He does it a lot in Immortal Hulk, and he's doing it here, where the title of the book, that title page, is almost part of the dialogue, So in the first issue, you have the young George talking to his mother, and there's See the Space God, and he kind of whispers to himself, why isn't it moving? And then you turn the page, and then you get the title, We Only Find Them When They're Dead. That becomes a recurring part of the comic. Like, that is a phrase he's almost repeating to himself, and it's part of the dialogue and also the title. It's a really neat trick that Ewing, I think, does in some other books as well.
Yeah. I don't know if I actually picked up on that, so thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, I think it's issue 3 or 4, where there's another flashback where he's talking to his mother, and she says, oh, George, don't you realize? And then it turned the page, and that's the title. It's like that's what the next thing she would say, in that sentence. So yeah, it's a neat trick. It's a book that does feel like it's a very unique book to me. I think it has some very distinct creators who have their own distinct style, and they seem to work really well together, and it makes for a really satisfying read. And I think if you are curious, if you haven't read it yet, hopefully we've done a good job selling it, because I think more people should get their eyes on this.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the word unique. Like there are elements of traditional sci-fi that you can find in this book, but it is very much unlike anything else I've ever really consumed.
Sure. Which is so funny to me, because again, like I said, space gods and comics, they go together so well. So when I heard about this book and read the premise, it was one of those things like, why hasn't anyone else done this yet? This seems like such an amazing idea. I'm kind of surprised that I haven't seen anyone else try it,
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I think a lot of comics, the most interesting thing about their space gods to their comic is that they are a living and active presence in the book.
Yes,
Galactus is interesting because he's a threat and he has to be confronted and stopped. So I think it's a really interesting take to say, what if what if these gods are just carcasses and we are the flies buzzing around them?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And again, I like the idea. Again, you hinted at the way some characters see it as so mundane and ordinary. And again, it's like the wonder of the concept being undersold kind of makes it more interesting in a way. If that makes sense, you know? It's like, you've probably never read all of Jack Kirby's Fourth World stuff, the New God stuff, but there's one issue in that, and it's burned into my memory. It's one of those amazing Jack Kirby double-page spreads, and he's talking about as you get closer to the edge of the universe, the edge where the source wall is, you find the bodies of ancient gods who were basically trapped there and couldn't get back because they were trying to go beyond the source wall and didn't work. And there's this image of a giant, enormous space god chained to a meteor, like an asteroid. And it's the classic Jack Kirby, hyperbole, like a billion years passes between each heartbeat. But he's like this giant space god strapped to an asteroid, and that's like burned in my brain. I'm like, yeah, Al Ewing saw that too, and that must be where he got the idea for this book, right? It's one of these things like space gods and comics are so intertwined. To have a fresh take on it is really exciting. I guess that's what I'm getting at. I just want to talk about Jack Kirby for a second, of course, if we're talking about space gods. So.
Yeah, I think that you'd be doing this book a disservice if you didn't mention it. Right. Yeah. So it's not a frame of reference that I have, not being the comics classicist.
But you recognize the source. A lot of that stuff is that sort of the cool thing you can do with comics. You're only limited by your imagination and what you can draw, or you can pay someone else to draw. So you can kind of do stories like that with space gods, which might not work in any other medium. So yeah, and I very briefly kind of want to ask, I'm not as big of a sci-fi fan, I think, as you are, but I'm kind of glad that we both found something attractive about this book in that it's sci-fi, but it's more personal. It doesn't feel, it's not, even though it's high concept, it doesn't feel as high concept as some other science fiction that I've had trouble getting into. Is that your take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some sci-fi authors tend to get bogged down in the details of the world they're trying to create, and Ewing definitely doesn't do that. Like he tells us, these gods are incredibly valuable. You can make a lot of money off the flesh and the eye jelly and all that stuff, but he doesn't get down the rabbit hole of, well, you see, if we harvest this part, then it can be used to make this, and that's good for spaceships. And,
Right. Yeah.
We are just told that it's valuable. We are shown people risking their lives to get it, so we understand the degree of value, and then that's it. We don't need to worry about it too much after that.
Yeah, there's more important things to be discussed than the space gods, right? So... But that's a good point. Again, we talked about trusting Ewing as a writer and him trusting the audience. There's very little exposition in this book, which made it a little bit difficult at first, and that's what I think makes it a better book to go back and reread or read in one sitting, because there is very little of hand-holding and there's very little exposition. There seems to be, I don't want to call it like an omniscient narrator, but there's little bits where there are captions saying, this is the ship, it's a 4-person crew, or I'll tell you what time a certain scene is taking place, but that's about it. There's not much other setup that's being given to you aside from the dialogue between the characters.
Yeah, it's very everything is conveyed in universe beyond just giving you that like bare bones framework of like, this is a spaceship. You as a human on Earth are not going to have any way to know, the size of the spaceship or the crew complement unless they just tell you. Right.
Yeah, and again, I think that is almost more interesting to me. I think one of my hang-ups with a lot of sci-fi, as you said, is that they get bogged down in the details, or there's too much exposition, trying to make sure you understand exactly what's going on, or explain the science there. And, I don't need much science beyond they're space gods, and this is a spaceship. You don't need to go much further in detail for me. So I think, again, it's a comic that I initially was I don't know how to put this. I wanted to enjoy more than I did, but as I kept reading, and especially when I went back to reread, I really enjoyed a lot. You know, it really grabbed me again when I went back to reread it. So I guess I have to say thank you for making me go back and reread it to talk about it, because now I'm jazzed for Volume 2 to come out.
Yeah, this is one of those books that I keep telling people to read because I just want to talk about it, and
sure.
I can't do that unless I can force somebody else to get into it.
I see the grand scheme here, Brian. So do you maybe want to should we speculate on what we think might happen down the line, or should we? I feel if we do that, we might have to give away some spoilers, but yeah, maybe we should keep that to ourselves.
Yeah, maybe we can write our predictions down, and then when we come back to do Volume 2, we can see if we were right or not.
Yeah. I'm very curious to see how it plays out. I think again, I hinted at the relationships between the crew. I think are really interesting. George is a very complex character, and I think we're only getting a small snippet of him in this first volume. You know, obviously we're learning about his background and his past, but you know, the way he sort of interacts with the other shipmates, there's a lot there to be unpacked and explored, I think. So
yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think we can count on Ewing to do that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I don't know, Brian. Do you have anything else? I have to say thank you for making me reread this and to talk about it. And I'm glad that you liked it. Again, I think you picked up based on my recommendation. I'm always hesitant when people do that because if they don't like it, then I feel personally responsible. So I'm glad you're enthusiastic about this book.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on all day. So instead of doing that, I think I will just wrap us up here. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at BrianHead. Paul is at OhiPauly. You can follow the show at IRCB Podcast. And
this episode first aired on our Patreon and was made possible because of our wonderful Patreons who support us over there. You can join today for more exclusive series like the IRCB Movie Club, Saga of Saga, Giant Days of Our Lives, and much more. That's over at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. And if you haven't already, please take a minute to rate and review the show. I think 5 stars is a fair rating. You can do that on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It honestly really helps spread the word about the show.
You can also join us at the IRCB Discord to chat about comics and more and listen to our episodes live as we record them. You can do that at ircbpodcast.com/Discord. And it would help us so much if you would just tell your friends about the show, or maybe even your local comic shop. Infinity Shred is the best band in the galaxy. They do the music for our show. Xander is the ancient space god who edits the show and makes everything possible. I want to say thank you to Xander for editing. Thank you to Paul for joining me on this episode. Thank you to you, the listener, for joining us. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.